In the early 1970s, when Clint Eastwood walked onto the set of The Tonight Show, the moment looked exactly as America expected. Relaxed posture, measured smile, a movie star stepping into late-night comfort, greeted by laughter, applause, and an easy handshake from Johnny Carson. Nothing felt unusual, nothing hinted at tension, nothing suggested history, and that was the point. Because what most viewers believed at the time was simple: Johnny Carson was television's safe companion, the man who sent America to bed, smiling. Clint Eastwood was the screen embodiment of confidence, control, and unshakable strength. Neither man, in the public imagination, carried a war with him. But quietly, that assumption was wrong. The truth is smaller than legend, but heavier than myth. Johnny Carson wasn't just a talk show host. He had served in the U.S. Navy during World War II. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a movie tough guy. He had been drafted into the U.S. Army during the Korean War era. Those facts are real. They're documented. And yet, they almost never surfaced in the places where millions were listening. Here's the contradiction. These were two men who spoke to America constantly. One every single night, the other through some of the most iconic characters of the era. And still, when it came to war, they chose silence. Not denial, not reinvention. Silence. The Korean War was already being called the Forgotten War, while it was still within living memory. And many who lived through it learned something early. Talking wasn't expected, and remembering publicly wasn't rewarded. So the question isn't whether Johnny Carson and Clint Eastwood had something to say about war. The question is, why two men with the biggest microphones in America decided not to use them. And before we go further, I want to ask you something simple. Did your family ever talk about the Korean War? Or was it always quiet? Before either man became a symbol, they were shaped by places that taught restraint long before fame demanded it. Johnny Carson grew up in the Midwest, in a world where emotions were managed, not displayed. Nebraska didn't reward dramatics. It rewarded composure. You showed up. You did the job. You didn't burden others with what you carried. His childhood sat squarely in the long shadow of World War II. Patriotism wasn't loud where he lived. It was practical. When the war came, it didn't arrive as a story. It arrived as expectation. And when Johnny entered the U.S. Navy, it wasn't framed as heroism. It was duty, necessary, ordinary. Something you did, then moved past. On the other side of the country, Clint Eastwood was coming of age in post-war California, a place that looked brighter on the surface, but still carried the same unspoken rules underneath. Men didn't linger on fear. They didn't rehearse vulnerability. They moved forward. Eastwood was drafted during the Korean War era, a conflict that arrived without ceremony and stayed without celebration. It wasn't framed as a grand fight for survival like World War II. It didn't come with parades or lasting mythology. Even while it was happening, it already felt temporary in the public imagination. That absence mattered. Because for the men who served, Korea didn't feel small. It felt cold, confusing, relentless. And when they came home, they returned to a country already looking ahead. The phrase, "the forgotten war," didn't emerge decades later. It began almost immediately. There were no clear villains Americans could point to. No decisive ending people could remember. No cultural shorthand that made explaining it easy. So many veterans did what the culture quietly asked of them. They folded the experience inward. They didn't narrate it. They didn't shape it into lessons. They moved on. For Johnny Carson, that meant leaning into something entirely different. Humor, timing, control. On stage, he learned to read rooms, deflect tension, and keep things light. Laughter wasn't just entertainment, it was insulation, a way to stay present without reopening doors best left closed. For Clint Eastwood, the escape took a different shape, but served the same purpose. Performance offered structure, Characters had edges where real life did not. Strength could be stylized. Fear could be erased with posture, silence, and a narrowed gaze. Neither man returned from service eager to explain what it had done to them. And importantly, no one demanded that they do so. Hollywood didn't ask about war. Audiences didn't ask. The industry rewarded forward motion, not reflection. There's a quiet misconception about veterans of that era, that those who didn't speak simply had nothing to say. In reality, many had learned early that speaking carried no advantage. Johnny Carson was rewarded for keeping things easy. Clint Eastwood was rewarded for keeping things contained. Their success reinforced the lesson. The less they explained, the more comfortable everyone felt. And over time, silence stopped being a choice. It became habit. By the time both men reached national visibility, their pasts had already been filed away, labeled irrelevant, not denied, just unused, which raises a question that lingers beneath everything that followed. Why did Johnny Carson and Clint Eastwood, unlike some veterans who later spoke openly, never feel compelled to turn memory into testimony? Success didn't arrive all at once. It arrived quietly, in increments, and it rewarded very specific behaviors. For Johnny Carson, the climb was built on reliability. When he took over The Tonight Show, America didn't want surprises at 11:30 p.m. It wanted reassurance, familiar rhythms, a voice that could acknowledge the world's chaos without letting it spill into the living room. Johnny learned quickly what worked: sharp timing, self-deprecation, a tone that made everything feel manageable. What didn't work was heaviness. Network television, in the 1,960 seconds and early 70 seconds, had an unspoken rule: don't unsettle people before bed. Vietnam was already bleeding into the news. Assassinations had fractured the national mood. The last thing executives wanted was a host digging into personal war memories. So Johnny didn't. Not because he couldn't, but because the role didn't allow it. Night after night, he became Safe America at Night, the man who made sure the country could exhale before sleep. And every time that worked, the lesson deepened. Silence was not only acceptable, it was rewarded. Across the industry, Clint Eastwood was learning a parallel lesson. His early career was unstable. Bit parts, canceled shows, years where nothing seemed guaranteed. When success finally arrived, it came with a very specific image attached: the strong, silent man, controlled, minimal, emotion kept behind the eyes. Audiences responded instantly. This version of masculinity felt clean, contained, reassuring in its own way. And just like Johnny, Clint noticed what happened when he stayed within that frame. The fewer words he used, the bigger the reaction became. Hollywood took note. There was no appetite for complicated veterans trying to process history on screen. Studios didn't want reflection. They wanted symbols, heroes who didn't hesitate, men who didn't explain themselves. War, when referenced at all, was simplified: good versus bad, victory or defeat, never confusion, and certainly never aftermath. That created a real obstacle, even if it was rarely acknowledged out loud. To survive, both men had to compress parts of themselves, not erase them, but store them somewhere unreachable during working hours. The pressure wasn't just professional, it was internal. Johnny Carson was expected to be okay every night, no matter what. The host who never lost control. The man who could defuse any tension with a joke. There was no room for unresolved history in that role. Vulnerability would have felt like failure. Clint Eastwood faced a different version of the same trap. His characters didn't talk about fear. They absorbed it. They endured. The more audiences admired that strength, the harder it became to step outside it without disappointing them. There are moments in both careers where the strain becomes visible. Brief flashes, a sharper edge than usual, a distance that couldn't be smoothed over with charm or silence. Those moments didn't lead to confession. They led to reinforcement. Work harder, say less, stay composed. In that sense, success didn't heal the past. It organized it, locked it into a private compartment that never made it onto a cue card or a script page. And slowly, almost without intention, something else happened. Silence stopped being just a coping mechanism. It became part of the brand. Johnny Carson's restraint was seen as professionalism. Clint Eastwood's reserve was seen as strength. Neither image allowed space for a man still carrying unresolved memories of service. So the silence stayed in place, not because anyone demanded it, but because everything around them rewarded it. Which leads to the question that sits at the center of their rise. If silence helped build their success, what did it cost them to maintain it once fame made that silence permanent? By the time both men reached the height of their influence, their lives had settled into patterns that left very little room for deviation. For Johnny Carson, fame didn't look like chaos. It looked like repetition. Same studio, same desk, same walk to the mark under the lights. Every weekday night, he stepped out to greet America as it prepared to sleep. Millions of homes, the same theme music, the same opening rhythm, and behind that consistency was a schedule built to eliminate uncertainty. Meetings in the afternoon, rehearsals, notes from producers, a monologue carefully tuned to land without disturbing. Johnny Carson didn't just host a show, he maintained an atmosphere. Audiences came to him not for revelation, but for stability. He was there when the news was heavy, when politics felt divisive, when the world seemed loud, and that made him indispensable. But it also made him predictable in ways that left no room for the past to surface. Whatever Johnny Carson felt privately, it never crossed the desk. Night after night, he closed the day for America, and then he went home alone with whatever remained unsaid. Across the country and across the screen, Clint Eastwood had become something else entirely. Not a companion, but a projection. The embodiment of restraint, masculinity stripped of explanation. A man who didn't narrate his thoughts because his presence was meant to be enough. His films reinforced it. His interviews reinforced it. Even his silences became part of the performance. By the time Clint Eastwood reached peak fame, audiences no longer saw an actor playing strength. They saw strength itself. And that perception came with an unspoken contract. Don't explain, don't soften, don't step out of frame. Daily life, under that expectation, narrowed quickly. Public appearances were controlled. Questions were deflected or answered minimally. Anything that hinted at doubt or reflection stayed off camera. The result was a strange inversion. The more visible both men became, the less space there was for their actual inner lives to appear. Johnny Carson spoke for hours every night, but revealed very little. Clint Eastwood said almost nothing, and that nothing became mythologized. Both roles worked. Ratings stayed high. Box office numbers climbed. But something subtle was happening beneath the surface. When fame reaches a certain level, it stops expanding who you are and starts compressing it. You become easier to recognize, but harder to fully inhabit. The person audiences expect begins to take precedence over the person who actually exists. That's the first open loop. What happens when the real self no longer fits cleanly inside the image that made you famous? Because images don't age the way people do. They don't accumulate memories. They don't need reconciliation. And yet, the men maintaining those images do. There's a second loop here, quieter but more revealing. At the peak of their influence, both Johnny Carson and Clint Eastwood had access to private spaces most people never see. Green rooms, dressing rooms, long pauses between takes, moments when the cameras weren't rolling and the performance temporarily dropped. Those are the moments where conversations happen, or don't. What stories were never exchanged in those spaces? What memories stayed locked behind polite nods and professional distance? What questions were never asked because asking them might have cracked the image. The public saw certainty. Behind the lights, life continued without a script, and the silence that once protected both men began to take on a different weight, not just as a habit, but as a barrier, because eventually, even the most carefully maintained image starts to leave something behind. Silence has a way of changing meaning over time. What begins as self-control slowly becomes containment, and containment, left untouched, becomes weight. For Johnny Carson, the cost wasn't visible on camera. Viewers saw confidence, rhythm, and ease. But silence doesn't disappear when the lights go out. It follows you home. It waits. The stories that never found language don't fade. They settle deeper, surfacing as restlessness, distance, or a constant need to keep moving so nothing catches up. For Clint Eastwood, the cost was disguised as strength. The fewer words he used, the more the world projected meaning onto him. That projection left little room for contradiction. Admitting fear would have broken the spell. Acknowledging uncertainty would have complicated the image. And so the silence held. This is where people often misunderstand trauma. PTSD doesn't always announce itself with breakdowns or visible collapse. Sometimes it looks like discipline. Sometimes it looks like productivity. Sometimes it looks like a man who never talks about certain years, because talking would require slowing down long enough to feel them. For many veterans of the Korean War, that silence wasn't personal. It was cultural. They returned to a country already turning its attention elsewhere. The war ended without a clear emotional narrative, no decisive victory that could be celebrated, no moral shorthand that fit easily into speeches or movies. The conflict slipped between eras, overshadowed by World War II before it and Vietnam after. Even the language reflected it. The forgotten war, not the controversial war, not the tragic war, the forgotten one. That forgetting had consequences. Veterans learned quickly that their stories didn't have an audience. There were no rituals for telling them, no space on television, no appetite in entertainment. Silence became the default, not because memories were unimportant, but because they didn't fit the national mood. And silence compounds. When one man doesn't speak, it feels personal. When millions don't speak, it becomes historical erasure. Johnny Carson and Clint Eastwood didn't cause that erasure, but their positions placed them inside it. They succeeded at a time when success required emotional containment, and as they rose, the incentive to remain silent only grew. Here's the dark turn. The cost of that silence wasn't just internal. It shaped memory itself. Entire generations grew up without hearing about Korea at the dinner table, without seeing it explored on screen, without understanding how many lives were altered quietly and permanently. Veterans aged, stories went untold, context disappeared, not through censorship, through neglect. That's the reveal most people miss. There is no scandal hiding here, no secret waiting to be exposed, just absence. An absence so complete that many Americans couldn't tell you why the Korean War started, how it ended, or who it affected. Men who served learned to believe that what they carried didn't matter enough to explain. And that belief doesn't stay contained to one subject. It seeps into how people see themselves, as survivors without witnesses, as participants in history that never quite arrived. Johnny Carson's job was to speak, but not about this. Clint Eastwood's job was to embody strength, but not to unpack it. Their silence mirrored the silence of millions. And when silence lasts long enough, it starts to feel like truth, as if nothing important happened, as if there was nothing worth remembering. That's the real cost. Not pain unexpressed, but memory unshared. Not trauma unspoken, but history left incomplete. So, before we move forward, take a moment and consider this. What shocked you most, how quietly this war disappeared, or how many men never spoke about it? If you step back far enough, a pattern begins to emerge. Not one of avoidance, but of adaptation. For the generation shaped by World War II and Korea, silence was not a failure of courage. It was often its continuation. They had learned early that survival depended on control. You did what was required, you absorbed what followed, and you moved forward without asking the world to stop for you. That instinct didn't disappear when the uniforms came off. For Johnny Carson, silence became part of a larger responsibility. He wasn't just an individual with memories. He was a nightly ritual, a steady presence during years when the country felt fractured. Speaking openly about war would have shifted the emotional center of his role. And for a man whose job was to lower the temperature of the room, restraint wasn't avoidance. It was professionalism. People sometimes ask why he almost never referenced his service. The more accurate question is whether there was ever a place for it to land. Late-night television wasn't designed for unresolved history. It was designed for release, for a soft landing after a hard day. Johnny Carson understood that intuitively, and so he compartmentalized. Not because he lacked reflection, but because he believed the audience needed something else from him. That choice came with a cost, but it also had a logic. For Clint Eastwood, the logic unfolded more slowly. Early in his career, silence worked in his favor. It allowed audiences to project strength onto him without resistance. But as time passed, something shifted. Eastwood aged, the culture changed, and the space for reflection widened. When he eventually turned to war as a filmmaker, the perspective was different. The films didn't chase spectacle. They lingered on ambiguity, on consequence, on the distance between myth and lived experience. These weren't the stories of a young man proving toughness. They were the stories of someone finally ready to examine what toughness had cost. That timing matters. Silence, for that generation, wasn't permanent. It was conditional. You didn't speak until you had the language, the authority, or the distance to do it without being consumed by it. And that reveals the deeper logic. Johnny Carson didn't speak about war because he believed his role was to keep the country steady, not to reopen wounds on air. Clint Eastwood didn't speak about war early because his career depended on clarity, not complication. Neither choice makes them less honest. It makes them products of their moment. There's a modern tendency to equate openness with authenticity, to assume that speaking is always braver than withholding. But that framework doesn't translate cleanly across generations. For many who lived through Korea, silence wasn't repression. It was maintenance. It allowed them to build lives, to raise families, to contribute without collapsing inward. The problem arises when that silence is mistaken for absence. When history interprets quiet as emptiness, that's where fame complicates things. Being famous gives you a platform, but it doesn't automatically give you permission. The platform comes with expectations. Johnny Carson was expected to soothe. Clint Eastwood was expected to embody resolve. Deviating from those expectations carried consequences, not just for them, but for the audiences who relied on those images. So the real tension wasn't internal conflict alone. It was timing. When is a culture ready to hear what its heroes actually carry? And when does silence stop protecting and start erasing? For Johnny Carson, that moment never fully arrived on camera. His contribution was indirect. He normalized calm in a loud era. He gave space without filling it with himself. For Clint Eastwood, the moment arrived later, through stories that asked harder questions and refused easy conclusions. Neither path is complete on its own. Together, they form a map. Silence as survival, speech as reckoning, and in between, a generation that carried memory not because it was unimportant, but because they believed carrying it quietly was the only way forward. Late at night, long after the studio lights have cooled, there is a different kind of silence. The television is off. No applause, no theme music, easing the day to a close. Just a room that has returned to itself. This is where the stories that never made it on air tend to linger. not as speeches or explanations, but as presence, the kind you feel rather than hear, the kind that doesn't ask to be understood, only acknowledged. For men like Johnny Carson, silence became a way of holding the country steady when it needed calm more than confession. For men like Clint Eastwood, silence became a posture that allowed strength to exist without constant defense. And for countless others, it was simply how life continued. The wars that aren't fully told don't disappear. They move quietly through generations, showing up in pauses, in habits, in the things people avoid naming. Memory doesn't always survive through repetition. Sometimes it survives through restraint. There are evenings when nothing is said, and yet everything important remains present. Those moments don't demand witnesses. They don't need resolution. They exist whether we are paying attention or not. And maybe that's the final truth, that some histories aren't loud, some courage isn't explained, and some silence is not forgetting, but a different way of remembering. If this story stayed with you, a simple like can stand as a quiet tribute.